If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge. And when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the podcast. Chapter 1. The Seeds of Ambition, Foundations of a Legend. Part 1. A Prince is Born. The World Welcomes Alexander, 356 BC. The summer of 356 BC brought extraordinary events across the ancient world, but none would prove more significant than a birth in the royal palace of Pella. As Queen Olympias labored to bring forth her child, strange reports arrived from distant lands. The magnificent temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the world's greatest wonders, had burst into flames. Soothsayers whispered that the goddess herself had abandoned her shrine to attend the birth of a future destroyer of Asia. King Philip II of Macedon paced the palace corridors, his mind torn between anticipation and political calculation. His kingdom stood at a crossroads, growing stronger each day through military innovation and diplomatic cunning. The Greek city-states to the south viewed Macedon with suspicion, considering its people barely civilized barbarians. Yet Philip harbored grand ambitions that would require an heir capable of surpassing even his own achievements. When the infant's cries finally echoed through the palace, Philip held his son with hands that had wielded sword and stylus equally well. This child would inherit not just a throne, but the weight of prophecies already swirling around his birth. Palace priests spoke of dreams and omens, suggesting this boy would conquer lands beyond the known world. Queen Olympias, fierce and mystical by nature, claimed divine parentage for her son. She whispered to courtiers that Zeus himself had visited her chamber in the form of a serpent, making her child part god. Whether truth or political theater, these claims would follow Alexander throughout his life, creating expectations that would drive him to extraordinary lengths. The royal household into which Alexander arrived crackled with tension and ambition. Philip maintained multiple wives for political alliances, creating a web of competing interests and jealousies. Olympias fought constantly with her husband's other wives, each woman scheming to position her children for power. Young Alexander observed these battles from his earliest days, learning that loyalty could shift like sand and that strength often mattered more than blood. Palace servants noted the infant's unusual intensity, his bright eyes seeming to absorb everything around him. As he grew from baby to toddler, Alexander displayed a restless energy that worried his nurses. He seemed driven by some inner fire, as if the prophecies surrounding his birth had awakened something within his very soul. The political significance of Alexander's arrival extended far beyond Macedon's borders. Foreign ambassadors reported the birth to their home cities, recognizing that Philip's heir might one day threaten their own territories. The Persian Empire, vast and seemingly invincible, paid little attention to events in distant Macedon. This oversight would prove costly. As Alexander took his first steps in the palace corridors, he entered a world where every action carried political weight, and every relationship held potential for both alliance and betrayal. The forces that would shape his character were already in motion, setting the stage for a childhood unlike any other royal heir in history. Part 2. Royal Education, Tutors, Philosophy, and the Making of a Mind. When Alexander reached his 13th year, Philip II made a decision that would change the course of history. The king summoned Aristotle, the most brilliant philosopher of the age, to become his son's personal tutor. This was no ordinary arrangement. Philip understood that conquering lands required more than military might. It demanded a ruler who could think, reason, and inspire. Aristotle arrived at the quiet village of Mysa, where Philip had built a special school away from the distractions of court life. Here, in peaceful gardens surrounded by marble columns, the greatest mind of the ancient world began shaping the future conqueror. The curriculum was unlike anything offered to other royal children. Mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and geography filled the morning hours. Philosophy and ethics occupied the afternoons. The young prince absorbed everything with remarkable intensity. Aristotle taught him that knowledge was power, but wisdom was greater still. They discussed the nature of courage, the responsibilities of leadership, and the delicate balance between justice and strength. Alexander learned that a true king must understand both his enemies and his subjects, seeing the world through many different eyes. Homer's epic poems became Alexander's obsession. Night after night, he read about Achilles, the legendary warrior who chose glorious death over a long, ordinary life. Aristotle watched his students' fascination with these heroes and carefully guided those passions. He taught Alexander that real greatness came not from mindless violence, but from noble purpose and intelligent action. Geography lessons opened Alexander's mind to the vast world beyond Greece. Aristotle described distant lands filled with strange customs, exotic treasures, and different ways of thinking. He spoke of the Persian Empire, vast and wealthy, stretching from Egypt to India. These stories planted seeds of curiosity that would later bloom into unstoppable ambition. The relationship between teacher and student grew deeper than mere instruction. They debated governance, discussing how different peoples might be ruled with both firmness and respect. Aristotle emphasized that truly great leaders adapted their methods to fit their subjects, understanding that strength alone created only temporary victories. Philip watched his son's transformation with satisfaction. The wild, impulsive boy was becoming a thoughtful young man who could argue philosophy as skillfully as he wielded a sword. This education served Philip's larger strategy, preparing Alexander not just to inherit Macedon, but to lead all of Greece and perhaps achieve even greater conquests. When Alexander turned 16, his formal education with Aristotle ended, but their bond remained strong. The prince carried his teacher's lessons into every future battle and political decision. The combination of philosophical wisdom and heroic ambition would prove irresistible when Alexander finally took power. He had learned to see himself as more than a king. He was destined to become a bridge between worlds, carrying Greek culture to distant lands while respecting the peoples he encountered. Part 3. Bloodlines and Betrayals. The Shaping of Macedon. The philosophical lessons from Aristotle meant little in the poisonous atmosphere of Philip's court. Every meal could be a trap. Every smile might hide a dagger. Alexander learned to read faces as carefully as he read Homer's verses, knowing that survival depended on recognizing friend from foe. Olympias burned with jealousy toward Philip's other wives. The king had married 7 times, each union designed to strengthen political bonds with neighboring kingdoms. But for Olympias, these marriages felt like personal attacks. She watched Philip's newest wife, Cleopatra Eurydice, with particular hatred. This young Macedonian woman threatened not only Olympia's position, but Alexander's claim to the throne. The palace corridors buzzed with whispered plots. Servants carried messages between rival factions. Nobles shifted their loyalty like sand in the wind, always calculating which way power might flow. Alexander witnessed heated arguments between his parents, saw his mother's wild rage when Philip brought other women to court functions. Violence simmered beneath the surface of royal life. Assassination attempts were common enough that Alexander learned to sleep lightly and never eat food he hadn't watched being prepared. His bodyguards weren't just for ceremony. They were his lifeline in a world where family members murdered each other for crowns. One incident particularly shaped Alexander's view of trust. A group of nobles attempted to poison him during a feast, hoping to clear the path for another heir. Only quick action by a loyal taster saved his life. Alexander was barely 15, yet already marked for death by his own countrymen. Olympias played her own dangerous games. She claimed divine protection from the gods and used her position as queen to strike at enemies. Some whispered she practiced dark magic, consulting oracles about her son's future. Alexander watched his mother's ruthless methods with fascination and horror. Philip himself lived under constant threat. Former allies turned into enemies overnight when their interests changed. The king slept with armed guards outside his door and tasted every cup before drinking. He taught Alexander that loyalty was temporary, bought with gold or fear, never freely given. These experiences carved deep lessons into Alexander's mind. He learned that power attracted both servants and serpents. Trust became a luxury he couldn't afford. Every friendship needed careful examination. Every alliance required constant vigilance. The prince developed an almost supernatural ability to sense betrayal. He could spot shifting glances across a crowded room, notice when conversations stopped too quickly upon his arrival. This paranoia would later serve him well during his conquests, but it also isolated him from genuine human connection. By his 18th year, Alexander had witnessed enough treachery to fill several lifetimes. The palace that raised him was a school for suspicion, where graduation meant either seizing power or dying in the attempt. These harsh lessons prepared him for the ultimate test that approached, his father's assassination and the bloody struggle that would follow. Part 4. Philip's Dream. The Unification of Greece. Philip watched the Greek world spread before him like a vast chessboard. Each city-state stood as a separate piece, proud and defiant, yet weak when standing alone. The aging king had spent years studying their quarrels, their endless wars with each other, their deep suspicions. He saw opportunity where others saw chaos. The Macedonian army that Philip had built was unlike anything Greece had ever seen. His soldiers carried longer spears called sarissas, weapons that could reach enemy lines before traditional Greek spears could touch them. They moved as one unit, each man protecting his neighbor, creating an iron wall that could punch through any defense. But Philip knew that military might alone would not hold Greece together. He began his campaign with careful precision. Some cities fell to his armies after brief sieges. Others he won through marriage alliances, wedding his daughters and sons to local nobles who could deliver their cities peacefully. Gold flowed from Macedonian mines into the hands of politicians who could sway their people toward Philip's cause. The king understood that every Greek had a price, whether paid in coins, promises, or threats. Young Alexander rode beside his father during many of these campaigns. The prince watched how Philip could switch from charming diplomat to ruthless conqueror within the span of a single conversation. In one city, Philip might share wine with local leaders and speak of mutual benefit. In the next, he would line up captured soldiers and decide their fate with cold calculation. The Battle of Chaeronea marked the moment when Greek independence truly died. Athens and Thebes, the greatest powers of the Greek world, joined forces one final time to stop Philip's advance. The battle raged for hours under the summer sun. Alexander, commanding the left wing at just 18 years old, broke through the elite sacred band of Thebes. These warriors, who had never known defeat, fell one by one until none remained standing. After Chaeronea, Philip's vision became reality. He called representatives from every Greek city to meet at Corinth. There, they formed the League of Corinth with Philip as its permanent leader. The Greeks would provide soldiers and ships for Philip's ultimate goal, an invasion of Persia. They spoke of revenge for Persia's ancient invasions of Greece, but everyone understood the real prize was the vast wealth of the Persian Empire. Yet Philip's success carried the seeds of future problems. Many Greeks served him out of fear rather than loyalty. City-states that had fought for centuries to maintain their independence now found themselves answering to a Macedonian king they considered a barbarian. Whispers of rebellion circulated in every marketplace and gymnasium. Alexander absorbed these lessons about power and resistance. He learned that fear could unite people just as effectively as shared purpose, but that such unity remained fragile. The prince saw how his father balanced brutality with mercy, how he rewarded loyalty while crushing defiance. These observations would shape Alexander's own methods when he faced similar challenges. As Philip prepared for his Persian campaign, he had created something unprecedented, a unified Greece under Macedonian leadership. But this achievement rested on the sword rather than genuine cooperation. The kingdom Alexander would inherit was powerful yet precarious, held together by the reputation of one man's military genius. Part 5. An heir ascends. The assassination of Philip II, 336 BC. The morning of the wedding celebration in Aigai should have marked the pinnacle of Philip II's reign. The Macedonian king had orchestrated this grand festival to celebrate his daughter Cleopatra's marriage, inviting nobles from across Greece to witness his power and prosperity. As dawn broke over the ancient capital, the streets filled with dignitaries, merchants, and common citizens eager to participate in the royal festivities. Philip himself seemed confident and relaxed, greeting guests with the easy manner of a man who believed his greatest victories lay behind him. The theater buzzed with anticipation as hundreds of spectators gathered for the morning's ceremonial procession. Philip had chosen to enter the venue without his usual bodyguard, a gesture meant to demonstrate his confidence in his subjects' loyalty. He walked between two young men, his son Alexander and his new son-in-law Alexander of Epirus, wearing a simple white cloak that symbolized his role as peacemaker and unifier of Greece. The crowd cheered as their king approached the theater entrance, but in that moment of celebration, tragedy struck with stunning swiftness. Pausanias, one of Philip's own bodyguards, suddenly broke from the crowd and plunged a Celtic dagger deep into the king's chest. The attack happened so quickly that witnesses could barely comprehend what they had seen. Philip collapsed immediately, blood spreading across his white robes as chaos erupted throughout the theater. Pausanias fled toward the city gates where horses waited, but he stumbled and fell before reaching them. Other guards caught up with him and killed him on the spot, ending any chance of learning his full motives. The immediate aftermath revealed the fragility of Philip's unified Greece. Within hours, rumors spread like wildfire about who might have orchestrated the assassination. Some whispered that Olympias, Philip's estranged wife, had arranged the murder in revenge for his recent marriage to a younger woman. Others suspected Persian gold had bought Pausanias' loyalty, as the Persian king Darius had every reason to prevent Philip's planned invasion of Asia. The most dangerous rumors suggested that Alexander himself had played a role, eager to claim a throne that might otherwise pass to a younger half-brother. Alexander moved with remarkable speed and decisiveness in those first critical hours. While others debated and mourned, the 19-year-old prince took control of the situation with an authority that surprised even his supporters. He immediately secured the loyalty of key military commanders and eliminated potential rivals with ruthless efficiency. His half-brother Amyntas, who had a legitimate claim to the throne, died under mysterious circumstances within days. Other nobles who had shown lukewarm support for Alexander found themselves facing charges of treason or worse. The young king's consolidation of power demonstrated lessons learned from years of observing court intrigue and his father's methods. Alexander understood that hesitation meant death in the violent world of Macedonian politics. He rewarded those who declared loyalty immediately, while making examples of those who wavered. The speed and thoroughness of his actions sent a clear message to both domestic and foreign audiences. This was not a weak boy inheriting his father's crown, but a formidable ruler in his own right. News of Philip's death traveled quickly beyond Macedonia's borders, sparking hope among those who had chafed under Macedonian dominance. In Athens, some politicians celebrated openly, believing the young Alexander would prove easier to manage than his father. Spartan leaders began planning to reclaim their independence, while Persian spies reported back to Darius that the threat from the west might have died with Philip. These reactions would soon prove catastrophically wrong. Chapter 2, Fire and Fury, Conquest begins. Part 1, Quelling Rebellion, the Fall of Thebes and Warning to Greece. Alexander barely had time to celebrate his father's funeral before troubling news reached him. Greek cities were stirring. Whispers spread through Athens and Thebes that the young king might be weak, that Macedon's grip on Greece could finally be broken. The death of Philip II had given hope to those who chafed under Macedonian rule. But the rebels had badly misjudged their new ruler. When word reached Alexander that Thebes had risen in open revolt, claiming he was dead and driving out the Macedonian garrison, his response was swift and terrible. The 20-year-old king gathered his army and marched south with frightening speed. Within 2 weeks, his forces appeared outside Thebes like a storm cloud on the horizon. The Thebans found themselves trapped. Their allies had promised support, but none came fast enough. Alexander offered terms: surrender now and face only mild punishment. The city's leaders, perhaps still believing in false rumors of Alexander's death, refused. They sealed their fate with that decision. The siege began at dawn. Alexander's engineers had learned well from Philip's innovations. Siege towers rolled forward while battering rams pounded the walls. The Macedonian phalanx pressed against every gate. Within hours, cracks appeared in Thebes' ancient defenses. When the walls finally broke, Alexander's soldiers poured through like water through a burst dam. What followed shocked even hardened warriors. The king had given a single chilling order: make an example that all Greece would remember. Buildings burned. Citizens fled screaming through narrow streets as Macedonian soldiers pursued them without mercy. By sunset, One of Greece's most storied cities lay in ruins. 6,000 Thebans died in the massacre. 30,000 survivors, men, women, and children, were sold into slavery. Only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared, showing Alexander's respect for the gods and Greek culture even in his fury. The destruction sent shockwaves across the Greek world. Athens, which had been preparing its own revolt, immediately sent ambassadors begging for forgiveness. Other cities that had whispered of rebellion fell silent. Alexander had shown both his speed and his ruthlessness in a single devastating blow. Yet the young king also demonstrated calculated mercy. When other Greek cities surrendered without resistance, he treated them with respect. This combination of brutal punishment for rebels and generous treatment for the loyal became Alexander's signature approach. Fear and favor would be his twin tools for controlling an empire. The lesson was clear: oppose Alexander and face complete destruction. Submit and enjoy his protection and rewards. As news of Thebes' fate spread, the Greek cities made their choice. The rebellion collapsed before it truly began. With Greece firmly under his control, Alexander could now turn his attention to the grand prize his father had planned. The young king's eyes looked east, toward Asia and the vast Persian Empire that awaited his ambition. Part 2. Crossing into Legend, the Hellespont and the Persian Gamble, 334 BC. The spring of 334 BC brought a moment that would change the world forever. Standing on the shores of Macedonia, Alexander gazed across the narrow stretch of water known as the Hellespont. This was no ordinary crossing. This was the doorway to Asia, to the Persian Empire, and to a destiny that had consumed his thoughts since childhood. Alexander understood the weight of history pressing down on him. Centuries earlier, Greek heroes had crossed these same waters to fight at Troy. Achilles, his legendary ancestor, had walked this path to immortal glory. Now Alexander would follow, but his target was far grander than a single city. He aimed to conquer the mightiest empire the world had ever known. The preparations had taken months. 35,000 soldiers waited in organized formations along the shoreline. Ships bobbed in the harbor, loaded with weapons, supplies, and siege equipment. Every detail mattered when crossing into enemy territory with no guarantee of return. Alexander's generals knew this invasion was a massive gamble. They were leaving the safety of home to fight an empire with unlimited resources and millions of subjects. But Alexander saw this as more than military conquest. He proclaimed this a sacred mission of revenge. The Persians had invaded Greece decades earlier, burning Athens and destroying temples. Now the Greeks would return that favor. This framing gave the campaign a righteous purpose that inspired his soldiers and justified the enormous risks ahead. The religious ceremonies began at dawn. Alexander personally sacrificed bulls to Poseidon, god of the sea, asking for safe passage. He poured wine into the waters and threw his spear toward the Asian shore, claiming the land as a gift from the gods. These rituals weren't mere theater. They convinced his men that heaven itself supported their cause. When the ships finally departed, Alexander insisted on commanding the lead vessel. As they approached the Asian coast, he leaped into the surf first, sword drawn, declaring himself the gods' chosen champion. His soldiers watched their king wade through the waves with divine confidence, and their doubts began melting away. The moment Alexander's feet touched Asian soil, everything changed. Word spread like wildfire through both armies. The Macedonian king had crossed the boundary between worlds. His soldiers felt they were witnessing history unfold. The Persians realized their greatest nightmare had arrived at their doorstep. Alexander immediately marched inland to Troy, where he honored Achilles at his tomb and dedicated armor to the ancient hero. This pilgrimage connected him to Greece's legendary past while announcing his own heroic ambitions. He was no longer just a king leading an army. He had become the champion of Greek civilization itself. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. His soldiers saw their leader as blessed by destiny. Enemy commanders recognized they faced something unprecedented. Alexander had successfully transformed a risky invasion into a heroic quest that would define everything that followed. Part 3. Courage at Granicus, Alexander's first battle for empire. 3 months after crossing into Asia, Alexander faced his first true test of destiny. The Persian Empire struck back with fury. Three powerful satraps gathered their forces at the Granicus River, determined to crush this young invader before he could advance further into their lands. This narrow waterway in northwestern Asia Minor became the stage where Alexander would either prove himself worthy of his ambitions or die trying. The Persian commanders made a critical error. They positioned their cavalry along the high banks of the river, believing the terrain would give them an overwhelming advantage. Greek mercenaries, the finest infantry in the ancient world, waited behind them in reserve. The Persians expected Alexander to approach cautiously, perhaps attempt a crossing at dawn when conditions favored the attacker. They did not know their enemy. Alexander saw the Persian formation and made an instant decision that horrified his own generals. He would charge directly across the river in broad daylight, leading his companion cavalry personally against the strongest point of the enemy line. His officers begged him to reconsider. Parmenion, his most experienced commander, argued for a night crossing downstream. But Alexander had already made up his mind. He would win through courage, not cunning. The moment arrived with thunderous intensity. Alexander spurred his horse Bucephalus into the rushing water, his bronze armor gleaming in the afternoon sun. The companion cavalry followed their king without hesitation, 2,000 elite horsemen plunging into the current behind him. Persian arrows rained down from the heights above. The water churned red with blood as horses stumbled and riders fell. Alexander reached the far bank first, his lance already broken against Persian shields. Enemy horsemen surrounded him immediately. A Persian noble named Mithridates charged straight at the Macedonian king. Alexander met him head-on, driving his spear through the man's face. But more enemies pressed in from all sides. Another Persian, Rosicles, swung his curved sword at Alexander's head. The blade struck his helmet with devastating force, splitting the bronze and cutting through to his scalp. As Rosicles raised his weapon for the killing blow, Cletus the Black appeared beside his king. The veteran cavalry officer brought his sword down on the Persian's arm, severing it at the shoulder. Alexander lived by seconds. Blood streamed down his face, but he fought on with desperate fury. His personal courage inspired every Macedonian who could see him. They pushed forward with renewed strength, driving the Persian cavalry back from the riverbank. The battle turned in moments. Once the companion cavalry gained solid footing on the Persian side, their superior training and equipment told. The Persian horsemen broke and fled, leaving their Greek mercenary allies exposed and abandoned. Alexander showed no mercy to these traitors who fought against their own people. Most were slaughtered where they stood. Victory at Granicus changed everything. 3 satraps lay dead on the field. Entire Persian provinces began surrendering without resistance. Alexander had proven that Persian power could be broken by courage and skill. His soldiers saw their young king bleeding alongside them, sharing their dangers. From that day forward, they would follow him anywhere. The conquest of Asia had truly begun. Sieges and strategy, Halicarnassus and Asia Minor. After Granicus, most Persian cities opened their gates without a fight. Alexander's reputation spread faster than his army could march, but one fortress stood defiant. Halicarnassus, the mighty port city on the Aegean coast, would test everything Alexander had learned about war. The city sat behind massive stone walls built by the best Persian engineers. Its harbors sheltered the enemy fleet. Inside, 2 experienced Persian commanders, Memnon and Orontobates, had gathered thousands of soldiers and Greek mercenaries. They believed their walls could stop the young Macedonian king. Alexander arrived in late 334 BC and studied the defenses. These weren't wooden palisades like those at smaller towns. These were towers of cut stone 30 feet high, with ditches carved from solid rock. Traditional assault tactics would fail here. So Alexander adapted. His engineers built enormous siege towers on wheels, taller than the city walls. Crews of miners dug tunnels beneath the fortifications, planning to collapse entire sections. Catapults hurled stones day and night, wearing down the defenders' resolve. The defenders fought back cleverly. They dug counter-tunnels to stop Alexander's sappers. They launched surprise raids from hidden gates, burning siege equipment before retreating behind their walls. For weeks, neither side could gain the advantage. Then Alexander combined his weapons in a new way. While his towers and catapults attacked the main gates, His miners worked beneath a different section of wall. When that wall collapsed in a thunderous crash, Alexander's infantry poured through the gap, while his cavalry charged the confused defenders from another direction. The city's outer defenses crumbled, but the Persian commanders weren't finished. They retreated to two massive citadels overlooking the harbor. From there, they could still control the port and supply their ships. Alexander made a calculated decision. Rather than waste more time on these last strongholds, he left a garrison to watch them and marched inland. He had learned something crucial. Sometimes victory meant controlling what mattered most, not every stone of every wall. The rest of Asia Minor fell like dominoes. Sardis surrendered immediately. Ephesus welcomed him as a liberator. Miletus opened its gates after a brief siege. Each victory brought more cities to his side. But Alexander's success created new challenges. How could he govern so many different peoples? He began experimenting with local administration, keeping Persian officials who submitted while placing Macedonian governors in key positions. He respected local customs and temples, winning hearts alongside battles. The Persian navy, now homeless without friendly ports, sailed away to find new bases. Alexander had achieved something remarkable. He controlled the entire Aegean coast. No Persian fleet could threaten his supply lines from Macedonia. By winter's end, Alexander commanded all of Western Asia Minor. His flexible tactics had proven that even the strongest fortresses could fall. More importantly, he had shown that conquest meant more than winning battles. It required governing wisely and earning loyalty. The road to Persia's heartland now lay open before him. Chapter 3: Crushing Kings, The Fall of Persia. Part 1: Clash at Issus, Alexander versus Darius III. The narrow coastal plain at Issus seemed like an impossible place for the mighty Persian Empire to make its stand. King Darius III had positioned his massive army between the mountains and the sea, confident that his overwhelming numbers would crush the young Macedonian upstart who dared challenge the greatest empire the world had ever known. The Persian king commanded nearly 100,000 men, while Alexander brought barely 35,000 soldiers to this fateful encounter in 333 BC. Darius had made his first crucial mistake by choosing this battlefield. The cramped terrain prevented him from using his vast numerical advantage effectively. His cavalry, the pride of Persian warfare, found themselves squeezed against the mountains with little room to maneuver. His countless infantry units bunched together, creating chaos in their own ranks rather than the overwhelming force he had envisioned. Alexander saw the opportunity immediately. The young Macedonian king understood that this battle would not be won through conventional tactics, but through bold leadership. While his disciplined phalanx held the center, Alexander gathered his elite companion cavalry on the right wing. His plan was audacious beyond reason. He would personally lead a direct charge straight at Darius himself. The battle began with the clash of bronze and iron as the two armies collided. The Macedonian phalanx, with their long sarissas, pushed forward in perfect formation while Persian arrows darkened the sky above them. But Alexander had already begun his legendary cavalry charge, cutting through Persian lines like a spear thrust toward the heart of their army. Darius watched in growing horror as the young Macedonian king carved his way through the battlefield, getting closer with each passing moment. The Persian king, who had never faced such personal danger in battle, felt panic rising in his chest. When Alexander's cavalry broke through the final line of defenders, Darius made the decision that would echo through history. He fled. The sight of their god-king abandoning the battlefield sent shockwaves through the Persian ranks. Soldiers who had fought bravely moments before threw down their weapons and ran. The mighty Persian army dissolved into chaos as news of Darius's flight spread like wildfire across the plain. In his haste to escape, Darius left behind something precious beyond measure: his family. His mother, wife, and children fell into Alexander's hands, along with the royal treasure and regalia. The Persian king had not only lost a battle, he had lost his dignity and abandoned those he was sworn to protect. Alexander's treatment of the captured royal family revealed his political wisdom. Rather than harming them, he showed remarkable courtesy and respect, ensuring they were treated as befitted their royal status. This act of magnanimity sent a powerful message throughout the Persian Empire. Alexander was not merely a conqueror, but a potential legitimate ruler. The victory at Issus transformed everything. Persian morale, built on the myth of their invincible god-king, lay shattered. Provincial governors across the empire began to question their loyalty. The balance of power in the ancient world had shifted decisively toward this young Macedonian who seemed to possess the favor of the gods themselves. Part 2. Tyre and Gaza, Siege Warfare and Ruthless Resolve. With Darius humiliated and his army scattered, Alexander now faced a crucial strategic decision. The Persian king had fled eastward, but Alexander could not simply pursue him immediately. The coastal cities of the eastern Mediterranean remained unconquered, and as long as the Persian navy controlled these waters, his supply lines from Macedonia remained vulnerable. Two cities stood as the greatest obstacles: Tyre and Gaza. Tyre presented an extraordinary challenge. This ancient Phoenician city sat on an island half a mile from shore, protected by massive walls and the surrounding sea. The Tyrians felt secure in their island fortress, believing no army could reach them. They had already seen other coastal cities surrender to Alexander without a fight, but they chose defiance. Their confidence seemed justified. Tyre had never fallen to a land-based siege. Alexander's response revealed both his tactical genius and his absolute determination. Rather than abandon the siege or seek another route, he ordered his engineers to build something unprecedented: a stone causeway stretching from the mainland to the island city. Thousands of soldiers, laborers, and conscripted locals began the back-breaking work of hauling massive stones, timber, and earth into the sea. The Tyrians watched in growing alarm as this impossible bridge slowly crept toward their walls. They launched ships to attack the workers, shot arrows from their walls, and even attempted to burn the construction with fire ships. Alexander's men built protective screens and towers along the causeway, turning the entire project into a floating siege engine. Month after month, the causeway advanced despite fierce resistance. As the 7th month of siege began, Alexander's engineers finally brought siege towers and battering rams within striking distance of Tyre's walls. The city's fate was sealed when Alexander managed to coordinate attacks from both the causeway and ships he had commandeered from surrendered Phoenician cities. The walls cracked, and Macedonian soldiers poured into the city. Alexander's treatment of Tyre after its fall sent shockwaves throughout the region. Furious at their stubborn resistance, he ordered the execution of thousands of defenders and sold the remaining population into slavery. The once proud commercial center became a symbol of what happened to those who defied the Macedonian king. Gaza's turn came next. This fortified city controlled the gateway to Egypt, and its commander, Bottis, refused to surrender despite witnessing Tyre's destruction. Gaza sat atop a high mound surrounded by walls, seemingly impregnable. But Alexander had learned from Tyre. No obstacle was insurmountable with enough determination and engineering skill. The siege of Gaza proved shorter but equally brutal. When the walls finally fell, Alexander's fury toward another defiant city knew no bounds. He ordered Gaza's population massacred or enslaved, and legend claims he dragged Bottis behind his chariot until the man died, echoing Achilles' treatment of Hector in Homer's epic. These victories transformed the strategic situation across the eastern Mediterranean. Phoenician naval commanders, seeing their home cities destroyed, began surrendering their fleets to Alexander. Coastal governors sent envoys offering submission rather than risk similar destruction. The young king had demonstrated that neither natural barriers nor ancient walls could protect those who opposed him. His reputation for both military genius and ruthless vengeance spread like wildfire, opening the path to Egypt and ensuring that future conquests would face a conqueror whose resolve had been tested and proven absolute. Part 3. God King in Egypt, the Oracle of Siwa and Founding of Alexandria. The news of Tyre's fall reached Egypt before Alexander's army did. Persian satrap Mazasis understood the message those blackened walls carried across the Mediterranean. When the Macedonian king approached the ancient land of the pharaohs, he found no armies waiting to oppose him. Instead, Egyptian priests and nobles welcomed him as a liberator from Persian rule. The Egyptians had endured 2 centuries of foreign domination. The Persians had shown little respect for Egyptian customs, often insulting their gods and traditions. When Alexander entered Memphis, the ancient capital, crowds lined the streets. They saw in this young Greek warrior the promise of freedom from Persian oppression. The priests performed the traditional ceremonies, placing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt upon his head. Alexander became pharaoh, accepting the divine status that came with the ancient title. But Alexander craved something more than political acceptance. Stories of his divine parentage had followed him since childhood. His mother Olympias had whispered tales of Zeus visiting her chamber. Now, deep in the Egyptian desert, lay the oracle of Siwa, sacred to Zeus Ammon, the Greek-Egyptian fusion god. Alexander decided to make the dangerous journey across the Libyan sands to consult this oracle. The expedition nearly ended in disaster. Sandstorms erased their path. Water ran low under the scorching sun. According to later accounts, ravens guided them when they lost their way. Whether through divine intervention or skilled guides, Alexander's party reached the Oasis Temple. Inside the sacred chamber, the high priest reportedly addressed him as Son of God. The exact words spoken remain a mystery that Alexander kept to himself, but he emerged from the temple with absolute confidence in his divine mission. This spiritual validation transformed Alexander's vision for Egypt. Rather than simply conquering the land, he would create something entirely new. At the mouth of the Nile, where the river met the Mediterranean, he designed a city that would bear his name. Alexandria would become more than a port or military base. Alexander envisioned a meeting place where Greek learning would blend with Egyptian wisdom, where merchants from across the known world would gather. The young king personally walked the boundaries of his planned city, marking key locations with barley flour. He chose a site that offered natural harbors and access to the Nile's trade routes. The city would have wide streets, magnificent buildings, and most importantly, a great library that would collect all human knowledge. Greek architects and Egyptian craftsmen began working together, creating something neither culture could have achieved alone. These months in Egypt changed Alexander profoundly. The oracle's words, whatever they were, convinced him that his conquests served a divine purpose. He began to see himself not just as a Macedonian king, but as a chosen instrument of the gods. This growing sense of destiny would shape every decision he made as he prepared to face Darius one final time. The Persian king was gathering the largest army the world had ever seen, and Alexander would meet him with the absolute certainty that the gods themselves marched beside him. Part 4, Gaugamela, the decisive battle that toppled an empire, 331 BC. With divine confidence burning within him, Alexander led his army north from Egypt toward the greatest confrontation of his life. Darius III had spent 2 years assembling forces from every corner of his vast empire. The Persian king commanded over 250,000 soldiers, war elephants from India, and scythe chariots designed to slice through enemy lines. Never before had such a massive army gathered on a single battlefield. Alexander arrived at Gaugamela near modern-day Iraq with only 47,000 men. His soldiers looked across the plain at the endless sea of enemy tents and banners. Many must have wondered if their young king had finally pushed too far. But Alexander walked among his troops with calm assurance, pointing out how their smaller numbers meant greater mobility and better communication. The night before battle, Alexander's generals urged him to attack under cover of darkness. "I will not steal victory," he replied, displaying the confidence that had carried him this far. He slept peacefully while Darius spent the night keeping his massive army in battle formation, fearing a surprise attack that never came. At dawn on October 1st, 331 BC, the two armies faced each other on the carefully chosen flat ground. Darius had selected this terrain to give his chariots and cavalry maximum advantage. His plan seemed sound: overwhelm the smaller Macedonian force through sheer numbers and superior positioning. Alexander arranged his forces with deadly precision. The companion cavalry took the right wing. The Macedonian phalanx held the center with their long sarissas bristling like a deadly forest, and allied troops secured the left. Most importantly, Alexander positioned himself where he could strike directly at Darius when the moment came. The battle began with Persian chariots thundering toward Macedonian lines. But Alexander's soldiers had trained for this moment. They opened gaps in their formation, allowing the chariots to pass harmlessly through, while javelins and arrows picked off the drivers. The feared war machines became useless almost immediately. As the battle intensified, Alexander spotted his chance. A gap opened in the Persian center as troops moved to reinforce their flanks. Without hesitation, Alexander led his companions in a wedge formation straight toward Darius himself. The sight of the Macedonian king charging directly at him, backed by his elite cavalry, shattered Darius's nerve completely. For the second time, the Persian king fled the battlefield. His retreat sent shockwaves through his entire army. Units that had fought bravely suddenly found themselves leaderless and confused. The organized resistance collapsed as panic spread through the Persian ranks. The victory was total and immediate. Within hours, the mightiest empire in the world had lost its center of power. Babylon opened its gates without resistance. Susa surrendered its legendary treasures. Persepolis, the ceremonial heart of Persian kingship, awaited its conqueror. But Alexander now faced challenges no Macedonian king had ever imagined. He controlled territories spanning 3 continents, speaking dozens of languages, following countless customs. The boy who had dreamed of matching Achilles now held responsibility for millions of lives across an impossibly vast realm that would test every skill he possessed. Part 5. Burning Persepolis, Vengeance and Symbolic Destruction. Alexander entered Persepolis in early 330 BC as the undisputed master of the Persian Empire. The ancient ceremonial capital lay before him, its magnificent palaces and treasures accumulated over 2 centuries of Persian rule. Gold, silver, and precious stones filled vast storerooms. Royal artifacts crafted by the finest artisans of the empire glittered in the light. This was not just a city, but the beating heart of Persian identity, where Darius the Great had once received tribute from across the known world. The wealth astounded even Alexander's battle-hardened soldiers. They found riches beyond imagination, enough gold to fund armies for decades. Persian nobles watched nervously as Macedonian troops moved through their sacred spaces. For 5 months, Alexander remained in the city, organizing his expanding empire and enjoying the spoils of victory. Yet beneath the surface, tensions simmered between his Greek followers and Persian subjects. On a warm evening in May, everything changed. Alexander attended a drinking party with his companions, including Thais, a Greek courtesan from Athens. Wine flowed freely as the conquerors celebrated their triumphs. Stories of Persian cruelties filled the air, how Xerxes had burned Athens 150 years earlier, how Persian armies had desecrated Greek temples. The conversation grew heated as old grievances surfaced. Thais stood and made a provocative suggestion. Why not burn the royal palaces of Persepolis? Why not repay the Persians for their destruction of Greek cities? Her words struck a chord with the intoxicated assembly. Alexander, perhaps caught up in the moment or perhaps calculating the symbolic value, agreed. Torches were lit and the procession began. What followed shocked both Greeks and Persians. Flames consumed the great halls where Persian kings had held court for generations. The magnificent palace of Darius burned alongside centuries of royal records and artistic treasures. Carvings depicting Persian triumphs melted in the heat. Libraries containing Persian history and literature turned to ash. The ceremonial center of an entire civilization vanished in a single night. The destruction sent shockwaves throughout the Persian territories. Many who had accepted Alexander as their new ruler now questioned his intentions. Was he truly the liberator he claimed to be, or just another conqueror bent on humiliation? Persian nobles began to see him not as a legitimate successor to their kings, but as a destroyer of their heritage. Alexander seemed to recognize his mistake almost immediately. Some sources suggest he attempted to extinguish the flames, realizing the political damage he had caused. The act contradicted his earlier policies of respecting local customs and integrating Persian traditions into his rule. This moment marked a turning point in his character, the beginning of increasingly autocratic behavior that would alienate many of his closest supporters. The burning achieved its immediate symbolic purpose, demonstrating Greek vengeance for past Persian invasions. However, it created lasting resentment among his new subjects and raised disturbing questions about Alexander's judgment and temperament as he prepared to pursue Darius deeper into the Persian heartland. Chapter 4. Beyond the Known World, Ambition Unbound Part 1. Pursuit to the East, Bessus, betrayals, and the Sogdian resistance. Darius was finished, but his empire still breathed. As the Persian king fled eastward beyond the Caspian Gates, Alexander faced a choice that would define his legacy. He could claim victory and consolidate his gains, or he could chase shadows across the endless steppes of Central Asia. For Alexander, there was never really a choice at all. The pursuit began in earnest as spring warmed the Iranian plateau. Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, who had murdered his own king, now wore the royal diadem and called himself Artaxerxes V. This act of betrayal disgusted even Alexander's enemies, but it also presented an opportunity. No Persian would rally behind a regicide, and Alexander could position himself as the rightful avenger of Darius. The chase stretched across hundreds of miles of harsh terrain. Alexander's army, already weary from years of campaigning, pushed through scorching deserts and treacherous mountain passes. Supply lines grew thin as they moved further from civilization. Many soldiers began to question why they were pursuing ghosts in lands that seemed to stretch beyond the edge of the world. When they finally cornered Bessus in Bactria, his own men delivered him in chains. Alexander's justice was swift and brutal. Following Persian custom, he had Bessus mutilated and crucified, sending a clear message to would-be traitors. But eliminating one pretender only revealed the deeper challenge ahead. The death of Bessus did not bring peace. Instead, it sparked a wildfire of resistance across Sogdiana and Bactria. These were not the organized armies Alexander had faced in Persia, but something far more dangerous. Local chieftains who knew every mountain path and hidden valley, fighting for their homeland with desperate fury. The warfare that followed tested Alexander in ways he had never experienced. Enemies appeared from nowhere, struck quickly, then melted back into the landscape. Fortified cities perched on seemingly impossible mountain peaks. The very geography seemed to fight against the Macedonians. Alexander found himself learning new forms of warfare, building siege towers to scale vertical cliffs and developing tactics for fighting in terrain his military manuals had never described. Gradually, Alexander began to understand that conquest alone would never hold these lands. He needed the cooperation of local leaders, and that meant making compromises that horrified his Macedonian veterans. He began incorporating Persian customs into his court, requiring visitors to prostrate themselves before him as they would before the great king. More shocking still, he started marrying his officers to local noblewomen and elevating Persian aristocrats to positions of real authority. These policies worked, slowly building bridges between conqueror and conquered, but they came at a terrible cost. Each compromise with Persian tradition felt like a betrayal to soldiers who had followed Alexander from Macedonia. The man they had served was becoming something foreign, something that made them increasingly uncomfortable in their own camp. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the very bonds holding Alexander's empire together. In the palaces of Maracanda, loyalty and ambition were about to collide with devastating consequences. Part 2. Love and Loyalty. Marriage to Roxane and the Murder of Cletus. In the glittering halls of Maracanda, Alexander made a decision that would bind his future to the conquered lands. He chose to marry Roxane, daughter of the Sogdian nobleman Oxyartes. She was said to be the most beautiful woman in all of Central Asia, but beauty was not what drove this union. Alexander needed to show the local aristocracy that he valued their bloodlines. He needed their daughters to bear children who would carry both Macedonian and Persian heritage. The wedding ceremony blended traditions from both worlds. Alexander wore Persian robes while performing Macedonian rituals. His officers watched in uncomfortable silence as their king knelt before a foreign altar. Some whispered that he had truly gone native. Others worried that the boy they had followed from Pella was disappearing entirely, but Roxane was more than a political prize. Alexander genuinely cared for this fierce young woman who had grown up in mountain fortresses. The marriage worked as intended. Local resistance began to crumble as prominent families saw their interests aligned with the conqueror. But each step toward Persian integration pushed Alexander further from his Macedonian roots. His oldest companions felt increasingly like strangers in their own army. The breaking point came during a feast in Maracanda. Wine flowed freely as Alexander entertained his officers and local dignitaries. The conversation turned to military achievements, as it often did when soldiers gathered. Someone began praising Alexander's victories, comparing him favorably to his father Philip. This was dangerous territory after too much wine. Clitus the Black, one of Alexander's most trusted generals, had saved the king's life at the Granicus River years earlier. He was old enough to remember Philip's campaigns and proud enough to speak his mind. As the flattery grew more excessive, Clitus could no longer stay silent. He stood and declared that Alexander's victories belonged as much to his soldiers as to their king. He reminded everyone that Philip had built the army that won these battles. Alexander's face darkened. He had grown sensitive to any suggestion that he owed his success to others. The room fell silent as the two men faced each other across the table. Clitus pressed on, his words slurred but his meaning clear. He accused Alexander of abandoning Macedonian customs and forgetting the men who had made him great. The argument escalated quickly. Alexander threw an apple at Clitus, then reached for his sword. His bodyguards had wisely removed all weapons from the banquet hall. But Alexander's rage was beyond reason. He grabbed a spear from a guard and hurled it across the room. The bronze point caught Clitus in the chest, killing him instantly. The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander stared at his friend's body, suddenly sober and horrified by what he had done. He tried to turn the spear on himself, but his guards restrained him. For 3 days, the king refused food and would not leave his tent. He wept for the man who had once saved his life, and whom he had now destroyed in a moment of drunken fury. This murder marked a turning point in Alexander's reign. His surviving officers now understood that their king's tolerance for dissent had vanished entirely. The man who had once debated strategy with his companions now expected absolute obedience. The bonds of friendship that had held his inner circle together were breaking under the weight of absolute power and endless conquest. Part 3. Crossing into India, Conquest of Porus and the Hydaspes. The weight of Clitus's murder hung heavy over Alexander's army as they prepared for their next great challenge. Word had reached the king of a vast land beyond the Hindu Kush mountains, where gold flowed in the rivers and kings rode into battle on enormous elephants. India called to Alexander like a siren song, promising riches and glory that would eclipse even his conquest of Persia. In 327 BC, Alexander led his forces through the treacherous mountain passes into the Punjab region. The monsoon rains had turned the landscape into a waterlogged maze of swollen rivers and muddy plains. Local tribes either submitted immediately or faced swift destruction. The king's reputation had preceded him here too, and many rulers chose wisdom over defiance. But King Porus of the Paurava kingdom would not bend the knee. This tall, magnificent warrior king controlled vast territories along the Hydaspes River, and he commanded an army unlike anything Alexander had ever faced. Porus brought 200 war elephants to battle alongside thousands of cavalry and infantry. These massive beasts, draped in armor and carrying archers on their backs, struck terror into the hearts of Alexander's horses and men. The Hydaspes River raged between the two armies, swollen by seasonal rains into a furious torrent. Alexander studied the waters for days, knowing that crossing under enemy fire would be suicide. His engineers scouted upstream and downstream, searching for the perfect moment and place to strike. Meanwhile, Porus positioned his elephants along the far bank like gray fortress walls, daring the Macedonians to attempt a crossing. Alexander's solution was masterful in its deception. He divided his forces, leaving a large contingent visible to Porus, while secretly marching upstream with his elite troops during a violent thunderstorm. The rain and darkness masked their movements as they crossed at a narrow ford 17 miles from the main camp. When dawn broke, Porus found himself facing enemies on two fronts. The battle that followed tested every tactical lesson Alexander had learned. His cavalry could not charge the elephants directly, so he ordered his men to target the mahouts who controlled the beasts. Arrows rained down on the elephant riders, while Macedonian infantry used their long pikes to wound the animals' legs and trunks. The elephants, maddened by pain and fear, began to trample their own troops as much as the enemy. Porus himself fought with extraordinary courage, mounted on the largest elephant in his army. Even as his forces crumbled around him, the Indian king continued to hurl javelins and direct his remaining men. When Alexander's cavalry finally surrounded him, Porus was covered in wounds, but still defiant. What happened next surprised everyone. When brought before Alexander, the defeated king was asked how he wished to be treated. "Like a king," Porus replied simply. Alexander, recognizing a kindred spirit, not only spared Porus, but restored him as ruler of his territory under Macedonian oversight. This act of magnanimity won Alexander valuable allies among the Indian nobility and demonstrated the diplomatic skills that made him more than just a conqueror. The victory at Hydaspes marked the easternmost expansion of Alexander's empire. His men had fought valiantly, but whispers of discontent grew louder around the campfires. They had been marching and fighting for 7 years through deserts and mountains, across seas and rivers. The gold and glory seemed endless, but so did the campaigns. When would Alexander finally be satisfied? Part 4. Mutiny at the Hyphasis. Limits of empire and army fatigue. The camp beside the Hyphasis River buzzed with tension that summer morning in 326 BC. Alexander stood before his assembled officers, maps spread across wooden tables, pointing eastward toward lands that promised even greater riches than those they had already conquered. His eyes gleamed with the familiar fire that had driven them from Macedonia to the edge of the known world. But something had changed. The faces looking back at him showed exhaustion rather than excitement. These were the same men who had charged across the Granicus, who had scaled the walls of Tyre, who had followed him through the Hindu Kush mountains in winter. Now they sat silent, their weathered hands clasped tightly, their expressions grim. Coenus, one of Alexander's most trusted generals, finally spoke. His voice carried the weight of 7 years of continuous warfare. "The men were tired," he said quietly. "They had been fighting since leaving home, through burning deserts and frozen mountain passes. Many had died. Those who remained dreamed of their families, their fields, their children they had never seen." Alexander's face darkened. He had heard whispers around the campfires, seen the reluctance in his soldiers' movements. But this was different. This was open defiance from his inner circle. He stood and began to pace, his voice rising as he spoke of the glories that awaited them. Beyond the next river lay the ocean that surrounded the world. They were so close to completing their conquest of everything under the sun. The officers shifted uncomfortably. Some stared at the ground. Others exchanged glances that spoke volumes. They had followed their king to the ends of the earth, but they would go no further. For 3 days, the confrontation continued. Alexander pleaded, threatened, and cajoled. He reminded them of their victories, their wealth, their place in history. He spoke of cowardice and betrayal. He even retreated to his tent, refusing to see anyone, hoping his absence would break their resolve. But the army held firm. Common soldiers joined their officers in refusing to march east. They had seen the monsoon rains, fought the war elephants, conquered kingdoms whose names they could barely pronounce. Enough was enough. On the 4th day, Alexander emerged from his tent, his face pale but composed. He ordered the construction of 12 massive altars on the riverbank, monuments to mark the furthest point of their journey. The decision to turn back was presented as his own choice, but everyone understood the truth. As the altars rose against the sky, Alexander must have felt something he had never experienced before: the limits of his own power. Even a king who had conquered the world could not conquer the hearts of exhausted men who simply wanted to go home. Part 5. The Perilous Return. Wounds, Rebellions, and the Desert March. The altars stood silent as Alexander's army began its long journey home, but the king who had conquered nations could not conquer his own restlessness. Instead of taking the familiar route back through the Hindu Kush mountains, Alexander chose a path that would prove more deadly than any battle they had fought. He decided to march through the Gedrosian Desert, a wasteland where Persian armies had vanished without trace centuries before. The desert stretched endlessly before them, a furnace of sand and stone beneath a merciless sun. Water became more precious than gold as the army stumbled forward, their ranks thinning with each passing day. Men collapsed from heat stroke while their comrades trudged past, too weak to help. The horses died first, then the pack animals, leaving soldiers to carry their own supplies on blistered shoulders. Alexander himself suffered alongside his men, refusing the small cups of water his guards offered him when others had none. During this nightmare march, a Malian arrow nearly ended Alexander's story forever. The wound in his chest refused to heal properly in the desert heat, and fever racked his body for days. His soldiers watched their seemingly invincible leader struggle to stay upright in his saddle, and whispers began to spread through the ranks. Some wondered if they would ever see Macedonia again. News from the western provinces made their situation even worse. Satraps who thought Alexander might never return had begun acting like independent kings. They collected taxes for themselves, raised personal armies, and ignored orders from the distant capital. Some had even declared themselves rulers of their territories, betting that the desert would claim their former master. Alexander's response was swift and brutal. Despite his weakened condition, he moved against the rebellious governors with characteristic speed. Those who had remained loyal were rewarded, but the traitors faced execution. Entire administrations were purged and replaced. The message was clear. Reports of his death had been greatly exaggerated. The survivors who finally stumbled out of the Gedrosian desert were hollow-eyed shadows of the proud army that had crossed into India. Thousands had died in the burning sands, and those who lived carried the memory of that terrible march in their bones. The easy camaraderie between Alexander and his men had been tested beyond repair. They had followed him to the edge of the world and back, but something fundamental had changed. Alexander had proven he could survive anything, but at what cost? His empire was intact, his rebellious governors crushed, yet the unity that had carried his forces across 3 continents was cracking. The king remained determined to push forward with his grand vision of a unified world, but his soldiers now knew the true price of following a man whose ambitions knew no bounds. The desert had taken more than lives. It had taken the last of their innocent faith in their leader's judgment. Chapter 5. Twilight and Legacy, the End That Made History. Part 1. Civilization or Chaos, Reshaping Empire and Facing Dissent. When Alexander returned to Babylon in 324 BC, he faced a challenge more complex than any battlefield conquest. His vast empire stretched from Greece to India, but holding it together required more than military might. The young king understood that lasting power meant creating something new, a world where Greek and Persian cultures could merge into one unified civilization. Alexander began implementing radical policies that shocked his own people. He arranged mass weddings between his Macedonian officers and Persian noblewomen, hoping these unions would bind the 2 cultures together. At Susa, he personally married Statira, daughter of the defeated Persian king Darius, while encouraging 10,000 of his soldiers to take Persian wives. The ceremonies were lavish, but many Macedonians saw this as betrayal of their own traditions. The king went further, recruiting Persian soldiers into his army and appointing Persian administrators to govern provinces. Persian nobles appeared at court wearing their traditional robes, while Alexander himself adopted Persian customs and dress. To his Macedonian veterans, their beloved commander seemed to be becoming foreign before their eyes. These changes created deep resentment among the troops who had followed Alexander for over a decade. They had endured years of marching, fighting, and dying to build this empire, only to watch their king favor their former enemies. The soldiers whispered that Alexander cared more about Persians than the men who had made his victories possible. The tension exploded at Opis when Alexander announced plans to discharge his older veterans and send them home with generous payments. Instead of gratitude, the announcement triggered open mutiny. Soldiers shouted accusations, claiming Alexander no longer needed them now that he had Persian troops. They dared him to continue his campaigns with his new Persian favorites. Alexander's response was swift and terrifying. He leaped from his platform into the crowd, he personally seizing the ringleaders with his bare hands. Guards dragged 13 mutineers away for immediate execution. Then Alexander delivered a speech that reminded his men of everything they had accomplished together, of the wealth and glory they had won, and of his own wounds suffered in their service. The emotional confrontation ended with both sides in tears. Alexander pardoned the remaining rebels and held a great feast of reconciliation. Yet the damage was done. The episode revealed the fundamental tension at the heart of his vision. Could an empire built through Macedonian strength truly become a Persian-Greek partnership. Alexander had transformed from conqueror to state builder, but his policies created as many problems as they solved. His attempt to forge a lasting multicultural empire had planted seeds of discord that would grow in the months ahead. The question remained whether his revolutionary vision could survive the resistance of those who had helped him achieve it. Part 2. Losses and Mourning. Death of Hephaestion and Gathering Shadows. In the autumn of 324 BC, death struck Alexander in the cruelest way possible. Hephaestion, his dearest friend and closest confidant, fell suddenly ill during a festival in Ecbatana. For over 20 years, these two men had shared everything: childhood lessons, battlefield victories, and the dreams of conquering the world. Hephaestion was more than Alexander's companion. He was his other half, the one person who truly understood the burden of empire. When Hephaestion died after a week of fever, Alexander's reaction shocked everyone who witnessed it. The king threw himself on his friend's body and refused to leave for an entire day. He cut his hair short in the ancient gesture of mourning and ordered that all the horses and mules in the army should have their manes and tails shorn. The sound of music was banned throughout the empire. Alexander commanded that Hephaestion's doctor be crucified for failing to save his patient. But Alexander's grief went far beyond normal mourning customs. He ordered the destruction of a temple to Asclepius, the god of healing, blaming the deity for abandoning his friend. He spent vast sums, some say 10,000 talents, on Hephaestion's funeral, demanding that a massive pyre be built in Babylon. The structure rose like a ziggurat, decorated with golden ships, centaurs, and eagles, visible for miles across the plain. The army watched their king's breakdown with growing unease. Veterans who had followed Alexander from Macedonia to India had never seen him lose control like this. Some whispered that the gods had cursed him for claiming divine honors. Others worried that their commander was losing his mind. The careful balance Alexander had maintained between inspiration and authority began to crack under the weight of his sorrow. Alexander's isolation deepened as courtiers and generals struggled to approach him. Those who had once competed for his attention now feared his unpredictable moods. He would fly into rages over small matters, then sink into dark silences that lasted for hours. The business of governing the empire suffered as Alexander became consumed with plans to honor his dead friend, including a proposal to declare Hephaestion a god. The king's health, already weakened by years of campaigning and numerous wounds, began to deteriorate noticeably. He drank more heavily and ate less. His legendary energy faded, replaced by a restless anxiety that kept him awake at night. Those closest to him noticed how his hands sometimes trembled and how he would stare into empty spaces as if seeing ghosts. The political consequences proved equally damaging. With Hephaestion gone, the delicate web of relationships that held Alexander's inner circle together began to unravel. Ambitious generals sensed weakness and began positioning themselves for advantage. The king, who had once inspired absolute loyalty, now faced growing doubt about his judgment and stability. The empire that had seemed so secure was beginning to show cracks that would soon become fatal fractures. Part 3. Divinity and Madness. Alexander's Final Days and Divine Claims. The grief-stricken king who emerged from Hephaestion's funeral was barely recognizable as the young conqueror who had crossed the Hellespont 13 years earlier. Alexander now demanded something that would have horrified his Macedonian ancestors: divine worship from his own subjects. He sent envoys to Greek cities ordering them to build temples in his honor and offer sacrifices to him as a living god. The request shocked even his closest advisors, who watched in dismay as their king adopted the elaborate court ceremonies of Persian royalty. In Babylon's grand throne room, Alexander now required visitors to prostrate themselves before him, pressing their faces to the marble floor in the Persian manner. His childhood companions, grizzled veterans who had fought beside him across 3 continents, found themselves forced to grovel like subjects before an oriental despot. Many refused outright, their anger simmering as they watched their king transform into something alien and frightening. The paranoia that had lurked beneath the surface since Hephaestion's death now consumed Alexander completely. He saw conspiracies everywhere, real and imagined. Minor disagreements became evidence of treason in his fevered mind. He executed loyal officers on flimsy pretexts and promoted Persian nobles to key positions, further alienating his Macedonian inner circle. Those who had known him longest whispered among themselves about the king's erratic behavior and wild mood swings. His physical condition deteriorated as rapidly as his mental state. The endless campaigns, countless wounds, and years of heavy drinking had taken their toll on his 32-year-old body. He complained constantly of stomach pains and headaches. His hands shook when he thought no one was watching, and he often stared blankly into space during important meetings, as if his mind had traveled elsewhere entirely. The final blow came during a drinking party in May 323 BC. Alexander collapsed suddenly, writhing in agony as fever consumed his body. Some whispered of poison, pointing suspicious fingers at those who had opposed his divine pretensions. Others blamed the malaria-infested swamps around Babylon or the effects of his years of excess. For 11 days he lingered between life and death while his empire held its breath. As Alexander lay dying, unable to speak clearly, his generals gathered around his bed like vultures circling carrion. When they asked who should inherit his vast empire, he allegedly whispered to the strongest before slipping into unconsciousness. Those cryptic words would soon plunge his empire into decades of bloody civil war, as each general claimed to be the strongest and most worthy successor to the God-King's throne. Part 4. Death in Babylon, an empire devoid of an heir, 323 BC. The morning of June 10, 323 BC, found Alexander barely clinging to life in the royal palace of Babylon. His fever had raged for days, and the king who once seemed invincible now lay helpless against an invisible enemy. The same generals who had followed him across 3 continents now watched him struggle for each breath, their eyes already calculating their next moves. Roxane, his Bactrian wife, heavy with child, wept at his bedside while his mother Olympias remained far away in Macedonia. The irony was bitter. Alexander had conquered the known world but could not produce a living heir to inherit it. His only child would not be born for months, and his half-brother Aridaeus suffered from mental disabilities that made him unsuitable to rule. The palace buzzed with whispered conversations and barely concealed panic. Alexander's closest advisors, Perdiccas, Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Antigonus, clustered in small groups, each faction already forming alliances for the coming struggle. These men had shared victories and spoils for over a decade, but loyalty meant nothing when an empire worth ruling hung in the balance. As Alexander's condition worsened, strange omens seemed to multiply around the city. Ravens fell dead from the sky. A wild ass wandered into the royal quarters and kicked over sacred offerings. The Babylonian priests muttered about ancient curses and divine retribution for the Greek king's hubris in claiming godhood. On his final day, Alexander could barely speak, but when his generals pressed him about succession, witnesses claimed they heard those fateful words. To the strongest, whether he actually said this or whether desperate men heard what they wanted to hear would never be known. By evening, the 32-year-old conqueror was dead. The news of Alexander's death spread through Babylon like wildfire. Within hours, the city erupted into chaos. Macedonian soldiers rioted in the streets, demanding their back pay and passage home. Persian administrators barricaded themselves in their quarters, uncertain whether they would be massacred or incorporated into whatever came next. The vast treasury that Alexander had accumulated sat unguarded as his former friends turned into rivals. In the royal palace, the generals faced an impossible situation. The empire stretched from Egypt to India, held together only by Alexander's personal magnetism and military genius. Without him, centrifugal forces immediately began pulling the vast territories apart. Local governors stopped sending tribute. Distant garrisons declared independence. The great experiment in world conquest was already dissolving before Alexander's body had grown cold. The immediate question of who would rule sparked the first violent confrontations among the successors. These were not philosophical debates about governance. They were desperate power grabs by hardened warriors who knew that in this game, second place meant death. Part 5. The Wars of the Diadochi, Fragmentation, and the Hellenistic World. The wars began almost before Alexander's funeral pyre had finished burning. His top generals, the Diadochi, had spent years learning from the master of warfare, but now they turned those lessons against each other. Each believed he deserved a piece of the greatest empire the world had ever seen. What followed was 40 years of bloodshed that would reshape the ancient world. Perdiccas, as regent, tried to hold everything together. He controlled the royal seal in Alexander's body, but symbols meant little when real armies were on the march. Ptolemy, the clever Egyptian governor, struck first. He hijacked Alexander's funeral procession and brought the king's golden sarcophagus to Alexandria. This wasn't just about respect for the dead. Whoever possessed Alexander's body held a powerful claim to legitimacy. The response was swift and brutal. Armies clashed across Asia Minor as old friends became bitter enemies. Antigonus One-Eye earned his nickname after losing his eye in battle, but he kept fighting to claim the largest share of territory. Seleucus built a kingdom stretching from Syria to India. Ptolemy fortified Egypt behind the Nile's natural barriers. Each carved out what they could hold and defend. These weren't simple border disputes. Entire cities changed hands multiple times. Families were torn apart as loyalties shifted with military fortunes. The great library of Alexandria rose under Ptolemy's patronage, while other cultural centers crumbled under siege. Greek soldiers settled in distant lands, marrying local women and creating hybrid communities that blended Eastern and Western traditions. The most savage fighting occurred in Greece itself. Cassander, son of Alexander's old regent Antipater, murdered Alexander's mother Olympias and his widow Roxana, along with their young son. The royal bloodline that had conquered the world died in a prison cell, extinguished to prevent future civil wars. The symbolism was clear. The age of Alexander was truly over. By 281 BC, the original Diadochi were mostly dead, killed in battle or assassinated by rivals. Their descendants inherited stable kingdoms that would last for centuries. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt until Cleopatra fell to Rome. The Seleucids controlled vast Asian territories until Roman expansion ended their dynasty. Macedonia itself became another Hellenistic kingdom among many. Yet something remarkable emerged from this chaos. Greek culture spread farther than Alexander's armies ever marched. Cities from Spain to Afghanistan adopted Greek architecture, philosophy, and art. Local peoples learned Greek language, while Greeks absorbed Eastern customs. This fusion created the Hellenistic world, a civilization that preserved and transmitted classical learning through the rise and fall of empires. The fragmentation that seemed like failure became Alexander's greatest victory. His generals couldn't hold his empire together, but they scattered his cultural legacy across 3 continents, ensuring it would outlive them all.